So good morning. Well done for making it to the first session of the day, which is a good start. So my starting point, and really something that's been in my mind throughout yesterday, looking at some of the talks and the state of practice that's being described, is this question, what comes first? Is it the social technology, or is it new org structures? So we've been pushing sort of social technology into companies for 10, 11 years, something like that. And I think I've reached the stage where I realize that actually we can't go much further in terms of delivering the benefits and the impact unless we address the organizational design questions in a very serious way. I personally don't believe there's any point taking an existing bureaucratic cascading hierarchy company and just adding a social platform so that the leaders can share some cool stuff from time to time and everyone goes, great, that's fantastic. That doesn't change the state of the business, that doesn't change our practice. So I think really for me, the time has come to look very seriously at the organizational design questions if we are to go any further with social technology. So there is a debate about this. I think some people would say, do we even need new organization structures? You've heard a lot of stuff yesterday about, no, what really matters is process, existing process, and we must build our social tools around existing process. I disagree. I think there's also a situation with consultants that they need buyers, so they can come in with interesting ideas, but ultimately, if there's nobody in the organization that can sort of buy those ideas, then they're going to struggle. And I think similarly with software companies, their customers are the CIO, the IT department, and they need that to be in place for people to buy what they're selling. And none of that is change. That's a market for consulting, and that's a market for software. But that's not necessarily going to change the state of practice. So, I like the way that social platforms and social tools create the possibility of new forms of organization, but that's not really what's important here. I think what's important here is the affordances, the capabilities that creates or that enables in an organization today. So it's not about having the platform, it's not about having the sort of status updates and activity stream, it really is about what that enables in terms of the organization. Now, I've been saying for a long time, we can't really fulfill the potential without org change. We think our companies are structured like this, they're actually structured like this. And I think there's more and more awareness that, step one, job one, is really deal with the org chart. If you have a traditional sort of org chart, then there are all kinds of assumptions and problems that brings along with it. Information has to go up a hierarchy and then back down a hierarchy. And also what you do is you set different parts of the organization against each other to compete for resources, to compete for attention, to compete for budget, and so on. And I think this is a really problematic situation. However, it worked. During the late 19th century, it worked. In the 20th century, it worked. When people dutifully trudged from school to university to the factory, hated their job but did their 9 to 5, this worked really well. But the fact is, the culture of work is changing. We still live in a world where we talk about human resources rather than talk about human resourcefulness. People can do pretty much anything. They're remarkably capable and talented, even to the extent of sort of water skiing ducks. But, the structures that support them are simply not there. I think where this gets down to hard numbers is when you look at productivity. I like to think that productivity has gone quantum. It's no longer linear. So we don't have this idea anymore that you come to work and you have a sort of steady path of productivity throughout the day. If you're a knowledge worker or a creative worker, the chances are you produce no value for large parts of your day, but then you can do amazing things and really creative things that produce that value. Supercell, this games company, they have 100 people. This is from last year, 100 people, and they're worth about $3 billion. Nokia, at the same time, had 100,000 people and were worth $5 billion. So there's clearly something changing in the maths around productivity. Facebook with a team of 12 to 15 developers can produce millions, tens of millions of dollars of value in a new product like the messaging platform or other new features that they roll out. So I think we've got to the stage where 12 people is the new army. Yeah? There's pretty much nothing you can't do if you get the right 12 people together and you equip them and give them the freedom and the empowerment to deliver the value that they're capable of delivering. So I think that's my starting point for thinking about org structure. And what's interesting is that there's really no point talking about leadership or analyzing styles of leadership or attributes of leadership unless we also talk about the kind of organization that they're leading in, okay? So there are some generic leadership skills for sure, but actually much of it is very specific to the nature, the culture, and the structure of the organization. And so I think it's interesting to discuss them together. So, hierarchy, which exists in most companies, is really only one dimension of organization, okay? It's the simplest top-down route from the boss to somebody who's talking to customers. And it exists, it will continue to exist, but hierarchy is an extremely inefficient and expensive way of organizing the day-to-day activities of teams. So what I think is going to happen is we're going to start to reduce the hierarchy in organizations. We're going to go down to sort of a minimum viable hierarchy, and then we're going to look at other dimensions of organization to orchestrate labor and to get work done. And I think the first part of that is the idea of small, coordinated, agile teams. This is the basic building block of new thinking in all approaches and methods around the organization today. So the idea is, yes, you may still have the hierarchy, but coming off like sort of, leaves from the branches of that hierarchy are pods or agile teams or whatever we want to call these groups of 8 to 12 or perhaps 15 individuals who are doing a task. And the key thing about them is that they are oriented and organized around a single goal, a single fitness function, and ideally they're as close to the customer or as close to customer need as possible. Then if we look at developing from there to more of a sort of structure, we realize that, if you want to do knowledge sharing or practice sharing between these teams, going up and down the hierarchy makes no sense. First of all, it's simply the distance is too long, the time is too long. But secondly, what you find at the higher levels of hierarchy is generic managers, people that don't have skills, yeah? They are just politicians, basically. They just run budgets, they run organizations, they screw with your project, but they're not an engineer, they're not a software developer, they're not somebody with a specific set of skills. And so they really can't add any value to that knowledge cascade. And we're already over the idea of best practice. You don't find practice in one team, take it right to the top of the organization, genericize it, and then cascade it down the whole organization. That's nonsense, complete nonsense. Nobody even believes in that stuff anymore. So we need to do a lot more work on how we connect these teams in a sort of peer-to-peer basis. And then I think what we find is that the other dimensions of the organizational model become at least as strong as the hierarchy. And I think the two key dimensions there are communities and networks. Communities and networks are very different. Communities are long-lived structures. You need to join them. They have rules. They're quite conservative in actual fact. Networks, fast-moving, they might be temporary, they might be networks of interest, but they both do a very similar job. So in an organization that starts to organize in a sort of podular fashion or an agile team fashion, or indeed using a methodology like holacracy, what you will find is that the pink people there who are marketers, or the blues who are engineers, or the greens who are designers, they need a home base, and their home base is not anymore their department and their line manager. Their home base is their community of marketers, their community of engineers, their community of developers, for example. But the other dimension, which is often missing, that makes all of this possible is what Dave Gray, who talks about this in the Connected Company book, describes as the sort of underlying platform. So, you need to take things like IT services, HR services, even facilities management and so on, and think of them as having a sort of API. You turn them into a service so that if somebody wants to start a team, they just grab their process off the shelf, they grab their HR stuff off the shelf, they grab their IT off the shelf, and then they adapt it to their needs. They don't have to go begging to a kind of powerful centralized IT service or a powerful centralized HR service in order just to get on and get their work done. So I think these are the additional dimensions that we need to focus on, and I think these are the ones that we need to develop a lot further than the simple hierarchical model. The alternatives to hierarchy are not new. This is not, we haven't just invented this stuff. There's plenty of case studies, not just about high-tech organizations or indeed socially calibrated organizations, but very traditional companies. The kind of classic case studies that we look at, Haier, Chinese former state enterprise that transformed itself into a very customer-centric model. It's still a very competitive organization. It's still in some ways a hierarchical organization. But it basically inverted its structure. So the closer you are to the customer, the more powerful you are. And if you are 2 or 3 steps removed in a sort of central service, then you are just a support function. So management is a support function for the teams that actually work on the ground with customers. Similarly, Kyocera, they talk about amoeba management. They talk about having hundreds or thousands of small teams, 5 to 50 people in their case, which are given operational independence, and they take responsibility for very specific areas of work. Another classic from the literature is Morningstar. It's one of the biggest tomato processing companies in the world. And no one has a boss. They have these sort of agreements between people. So if you as a team want to start doing a new process or selling a new product, you basically negotiate your own contracts on a peer-to-peer basis with other parts of the organization. And if you can do that and get sign-off for that, that works and you get on with it. So you don't need to ask for permission to begin to organize yourselves in the most appropriate way for what you're trying to do. Another more modern example is Valve. Valve is a really interesting company. They have no managers, and they have a system where your desk is on wheels and you have to pick up your desk and move it and work on what you think matters. So you can start your own projects, you can join other people's projects. It really is in your hands how to begin organizing your work. And I love Valve's handbook for new employees. It's hilarious. What it speaks of is really a culture of sort of Stockholm syndrome. People who are used to being prisoners and literally have to be taught freedom. How do you work with no manager? Come up with an idea, tell someone about it, work on it together, and ship it. That's their value creation process in a nutshell. Now, yes, they're a software company. Other companies may be more complex. But actually, if you boil this down, there must be areas of just about every business today where you can use these sorts of practice. It doesn't mean you do it across the whole organization in the same way. But this is a really, really powerful way of working with the right people, if you are indeed hiring the right people, which is obviously a prerequisite for this. When we looked at these case studies, I think there are some very basic lessons you can take out of it. Hire, the idea of autonomous teams, but also a very competitive culture. So they have this thing called catfish managers. So whenever you start a new project or a team, there's a leader, but there's a sort of a deputy leader who is also a candidate for your job. So there's sort of an inbuilt competitive mechanism. People are taught to cooperate until such a point as it's not working, and then the catfish will basically take over and take your team away from you. So it's not all sort of hippie flowers and nice ideas in these sort of non-hierarchical companies. Morningstar, we talked about the idea of the CLOUs. NGen is another interesting example where leaders are encouraged to work as community managers, first and foremost. That's really the key role they play. Valve, we talked about. And also, I think W.L. Gore is a really interesting one to look at because they talk about this idea of natural leadership based on getting things done and building teams. Those are the key metrics in W.L. Gore that mean that you can advance. So, those are some practical examples. They are practice first, not theory first. They've just developed because they had a visionary leader, usually, and they had a need to do something differently. That's where these stories came from. But now what we're seeing is a whole bunch of new thinking around the models and around how these models are used. So I think probably the most popular right now is holacracy. And Bernard will talk in detail about holacracy. It's a really interesting way of seeing the world, a series of sort of linked circles, draws on a previous methodology called sociocracy, which is about double linked circles, but it's also very different in some key ways as well. Another interesting set of ideas is Kotter and his idea of the dual operating system, the idea that you can continue to maintain a hierarchy, but actually build the other dimensions at the same time. So you've got a sort of 2 ways of thinking about things. And an example that is close to home for me is my friend Dave Gray. He writes about the connected company and the idea of pods. And we've been working on this on a practical level with some companies, and what you start to realize actually is that 8 to 12 people in a team, it sounds like a very small team. But actually, if you then organize a circle above that of 12 teams of 12 people, what you hit is Dunbar's number. So you hit a sort of an ideal size for a business unit. So really, with only one level of abstraction, you've got to a key level in a company. If you take it another level up, you're at the size of a small sort of division, and one more level up, and you're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that can be organized in this way. So the idea of a fractal structure, a structure that's sort of the same as it goes down, is a really interesting concept because it's resilient. We know it's resilient from nature and physics and all the rest of it. But actually, in terms of the organization, it's tremendously resilient because it's not got the single points of failure that hierarchies have. So if you've got one sort of douchebag manager sitting on top of a major branch of the hierarchy, everyone below them has got a problem. Whereas with double linked circles or single linked circles or a sort of fractal combination of pods, you don't have quite the same problem. So I think the other key question that we are seeing companies ask, and existing large companies now, is how would we do this if we were a startup? And I think the issue for me here is a really interesting one because if you take for granted what I heard a lot of yesterday, oh, the structure's going to stay the same, but hey, our manager's on a social channel. Well, great, that is interesting to me because actually, if they were to start again from where they are today, they would never reinvent the same structure that they have right now. And so the idea that we actually cement that structure in place by building our social tools around these existing processes only, I think is a fallacious idea. Actually, it's really interesting just to sit down and say, okay, we've got a blank sheet of paper. If we were a startup, how would we solve this problem? And almost always you'd solve it in a very direct way, using sort of getting things done, jobs that need to be done, these sort of modern philosophies of direct task focus rather than role and position focus. So I think the common features that we see from this sort of new organizational thinking are small teams, networked operations, not over-optimized for what you do today. That's the Nokia problem. Nokia massively optimized their organization for the past, and then they couldn't fight the future, and now they're dead, or in Microsoft, as we like to call it. And then there's also this emphasis on individual autonomy, sort of group and team autonomy, and fundamentally on agility. What you're looking to do with organizational structure is to create organizational capability, the potential for action in the future, the potential to respond to changing circumstances, rather than just have a structure that delivers the widgets that you make today. That's a dangerous place to be, and The Innovator's Dilemma is a classic text that will tell you why that's not a great place to be. So we've done some thinking about this, and we tried to sort of distill what we mean by a 21st century company into a series of attributes organized around structure, culture, and practice. And I won't bore you by going through these, but I think it's really important if you're talking about 21st century companies to begin to put some measurability behind this. And so we're developing sort of diagnostics, and we're developing some ways of sort of surveying organizations to really determine how far they are on this sort of journey or how far behind they are. But just to close on leadership, what does this kind of organizational structure mean for leadership skills and leadership attributes? I just wanted to pull out a few. I think one very obvious idea is this notion of connected leadership. This is from Harold Josh. This is very similar to what John Husband would be talking about if he was sitting with us here today. That's not him coming in? No. I think this is really a key feature of 21st century leadership. The idea that you can set context, you can do the sort of servant leader thing, you can listen and analyze, but really your goals are about developing networks and capabilities, not about being the hero yourself. I think the second characteristic is managing for complexity. Understanding that the ecosystems in which we work, the markets in which we work, and in some cases the companies in which we work, are really sort of complex systems. And you can't just sit at the top of them and direct them. You have to use sort of boundaries and attractors. You have to think of sort of cells and connecting cells and making links where no links exist. And also about adding a strong element of market pull into how that operates, because I think that's still the best way of orienting a company towards what it needs to be doing, is to be very customer-centric and very focused on customer and market needs. And that means also that leaders need to be something of a customer advocate. They need to be as close to customer need as possible, and then pull resources from the company to meet that need or to develop that capability. And at the same time, you know, if you're going to have a combination of both tight and loose operations, so you're going to have areas of the business that are very tightly controlled, maybe in production, maybe in engineering, and then other areas which are very loose, then you need the social fabric that we've been talking about over the last sort of day and a bit in order for that to work. And in terms of personal characteristics, Mark Benioff from Salesforce, you know, this is a man whose sort of charisma and ability to tell stories turns a CRM system into a sort of world-changing corporate spring revolutionary movement. You know, he's very good at that, and it's, you know, it's actually a good skill to have as a leader. If you can tell the stories, be the keeper of the stories, and pull people together on a mission, then, you know, you're going to be heading in a good direction, I think. But in most organizations, you need protected space. You need the space in which to try out new methods, new structures, and new ways of working. And in the UK, we have this government digital service, and they did exactly that. They basically took over internal IT functions within the Cabinet Office, began taking over the sort of websites and online services of different departments. But the first thing they did was they insisted that they have their own culture, they dress the way they want, they will link to civil service pay grades, but that's about as far as they go. And they've successfully created this basically organization within an organization that protects that culture and means that it's grown so strong that it now starts to suck in people from around it. So it's becoming quickly the you know, the dominant culture of delivery there. And it's all based on sort of openness, honesty about their deliverables. This is one of their ways in which they give you sort of real-time data about how well their services are working. And it's actually a really good case study. There's lots written about it. I would urge you to have a look. And I think finally, you know, all of this is not an argument for flat structures. It's not an argument for the end of leadership. It is an argument for the end of management, but not for the end of leadership. Leadership is more vital than ever in a distributed system, in a network system, and in a sort of podular or agile system. And I think we need to respect those characteristics, and we need to work to develop the right kind of leaders from within organizations that can do this rather than just sit on a hierarchy and push around spreadsheets and manage budgets. So it doesn't really matter what we're talking about here. We're talking about E2O, we're talking about social business, we're talking about change. You know, these characteristics are common, I think, across all of those areas, and it doesn't matter what we call it, but I think we urgently need to do it if we are not to end up in a sort of ghetto of software providers and fearful consultants who go into companies and just beg them for a little bit of change rather than have a vision for how business can be better and more effective in the future. So sorry if I went over, Björn, but that was my little bit this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions directly to Lee? So it's still early. Roger.
Hi, Lee.
Hi.
Thank you. That was good.
Thank you.
The image where you had like the fractal pod thing, you were talking about having like 8 to 10 people in one pod.
Yep.
And then you said like 12 people or something in the pod. But was it like
so
you have one pod with people in it and then a pod with pods in it?
Yes, exactly. So if you imagine the basic team unit being, let's say, 8 to 12 people, and then imagine 12 of those teams who cooperate in one area of the business. You know, what you've got then is roughly 140, 144 people, you know, that can operate as a business unit.
But then you have managers of pods.
Well, I mean, I think Bernard will talk a bit about this, but what you have is people in each team who link to another higher level circle. So they are leaders within that local area, but they're not managers in a conventional sense.
Hallie, another question. Why don't we have more examples other than Morningstars, the old food markets, and so on, of companies? And second, can we apply this to existing incumbents?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some very large existing companies who are trying this and working on this in a very serious way. So I think, you know, what's interesting to me is that when you talk to real leaders and CEOs of some of the largest companies, you know, they are, I wouldn't say they're afraid, but they know that simply further optimizing the way they've worked in the past really is not going to cut it, because they've got startups locally around them, and then they've got global competition from differently organized companies, conglomerates, groups of companies, networks, markets, etc., typically in Asia, for example. Why are there less examples? I think the answer to that is business schools. You know, we pump out people who are taught the domination of financial theory over business rather than the other way around. And so we have, you know, we encourage a generation of managers who are sort of schooled in spreadsheets, not schooled in value creation and sort of leading people. So I think that's part of the issue.
Lee, I'm Jane McConnell. I don't know
Hi.
if you saw my presentation yesterday. Well, I just ran the scorecard. One of the companies you mentioned, whom I will not mention, took part in the survey. I just ran the scorecard on them, and I'll show you the results later. But what strikes me is they completely broke the pattern of capabilities, where I had individual, business, enterprise. They have individual at the top, not at the bottom, as most do. And the second thing that's really striking about it is they have leadership very, very low. It's extremely low. It's almost off the bottom of level 1. And so there's something there that's corresponds to what you just said, and I'd like to talk to you about that a little bit more.
That'd be good.
Lee, the modular and fractal structure describes pretty well the way organization may operate. But what about the dynamics of decision making?
Well, let me take this off. There are sort of different. I mean, there are different dimensions of decision making. So, you know, the first and most important is, what do we need to do next? What does the customer need? What's the next step in this project? And that should reside, you know, in a pod as close to the edge of the organization as possible. If you go all the way to the other end, strategy, well, yes, we still need strategy. So we still need some people to sit around, to survey the market, to survey the company, and understand what the overall strategy should be. But actually, I think the majority of decision making really is a lot more sort of localized. And the fact that we continue to take it at too high a level is a real problem, because it means that people in a management role are sort of locked into big decisions that they're not really capable of delivering on, and they don't necessarily have all the information to make the right choice. And so that's when you get very simple decisions like, you know, look at IT. So an analogy for IT, CIOs and IT directors, you know, began as people that sort of try and build the best technology and run the best technology. What they ended up as was people with a big budget that once every 5 years says, Microsoft or IBM, do you know what I mean? Their decision became binary. It became, I'll spend all my money with this company. End of your job. You know, after that, what do you do? Rather than making small decisions every day about what's the next thing we need, what's the next capability we need. So I think that's sort of an analogy with management.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Yes.